3 true, scary stories. Christmas horror creepypasta that will chill you to the bone. The world outside was painted in soft hues of white, the kind of white that comes only with the first snow of the season. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets of the quiet suburban neighborhood were covered in a blanket of snow, muffling every sound. Houses lined the streets, glowing warmly from the inside, with the soft flicker of Christmas lights twinkling from each window. The smell of freshly baked cookies and pie from the decorated trees filled the air, as families gathered to celebrate the most beloved time of the year. Laughter echoed from homes, where children eagerly anticipated the arrival of Santa Claus, and parents reveled in the joy of togetherness. It was a scene that seemed untouched by time, a perfect, peaceful Christmas Eve. Yet, beneath this serene surface, there was an unsettling truth lurking in the shadows. The stillness of the night seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper of wind. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to disturb the peace. The comfort and warmth of the season didn't come without a price. For in every home that glowed so brightly, there was a story, a memory, or a presence that could turn the holiday cheer into something far darker. I've always loved Christmas. How could I not? The smell of the tree, the sound of carols, the warmth of being surrounded by family, and the anticipation of the morning light revealing gifts carefully hidden away for months. But what if all of this was only a thin veil over something much darker? The holiday we've come to associate with joy and giving can sometimes also carry a weight, a heaviness of the unknown. And when that veil is lifted, we realize that Christmas, for all its magic, has its own share of secrets. Tonight, I'll take you on a journey through 3 terrifying tales that have haunted me since I first heard them. Each one is different, yet all share something in common. A disruption of the holiday's familiar warmth by an unexpected visitor, an ominous presence, or an encounter that should never have been. These stories may challenge the way you think about the holidays, about the things that go bump in the night, and about the darkness that might just be lurking behind the festive lights and ribbons. In the warmth of our homes, we often forget that danger can come from the most unexpected places, places we least expect, especially on a night meant to be full of cheer. So, as you settle in for a cozy night of Christmas stories, remember, sometimes the things we think are harmless are the very things that can bring about our undoing. These 3 stories will show you how quickly the joy of Christmas can turn into something terrifying, as strange and sinister encounters shatter the illusion of holiday comfort. So let us begin. Story 1. The Shadow Under the Tree. The holiday season had come alive in the Johnson household. The smell of roasting turkey mixed with the faint scent of cinnamon from the nearby candles, filling the cozy living room. The warmth from the fire crackling in the hearth reflected off the brightly decorated tree, where a dazzling array of ornaments shimmered under the twinkling lights. In the corner, the stockings hung, waiting to be filled with gifts, and the soft sound of Christmas music played in the background, lending an extra layer of cheer to the night. It was Christmas Eve, and the Johnson family of 4, parents Alan and Lisa, along with their 2 children, Emma and Ben, were gathered together, celebrating the holiday in their typical festive fashion. The children, both barely able to contain their excitement, had already started making plans to sneak a peek at their presents after dinner, despite being firmly reminded that it was a tradition to wait until after dessert. "Can we just open one now, Mom?" Ben asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. Lisa smiled, shaking her head as she continued preparing the Christmas dinner. "Not yet, sweetie. Just a little longer." As the parents finished their preparations, the children eagerly arranged themselves around the tree, positioning themselves to be ready for what they had been waiting for all year. The firelight flickered across the room, casting warm shadows on the walls, and Emma and Ben laughed as they playfully bickered over who would sit closest to the presents. But as they began to settle down, something caught Emma's attention, a movement near the edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the twinkling lights and the warm glow of the fireplace. At first, she thought it was just the reflection of the tree's lights on the wall, but when she glanced again, she realized something was off. A figure stood in the shadows near the tree. The figure wasn't moving, just standing still, perfectly still. Emma squinted, her heart beginning to race. Her mind tried to dismiss the thought, but the figure didn't look like a shadow cast by the tree. It was too distinct, too solid. It seemed to have the shape of a man, tall and slender, yet something about it didn't feel right. The proportions were strange, as if the figure was stretched, unnaturally elongated. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that crept up her spine. "Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" Ben looked over, his face lighting up with the same curiosity, but he saw nothing at first. "What? Where?" he asked, squinting his eyes in an effort to see what Emma was pointing at. Emma hesitated, unsure if she had imagined it, but when she looked again, the figure was still there, motionless. Her stomach churned with an unsettling mix of confusion and fear. The figure, still hidden in the shadows, didn't seem to belong. It didn't make any sense. They were the only ones home. It was impossible for anyone else to have snuck in. She had seen the doors and windows all locked tight just moments before. "Mom, Dad," Emma called out, her voice shaking slightly. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of twinkling lights. At that moment, Alan and Lisa entered the room, carrying plates of food. They smiled, seeing the children gathered around the tree, ready for the Christmas festivities to begin. But as they entered, the figure suddenly shifted. It moved ever so slowly, drawing closer to the tree. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she watched the shadowy figure approach. It wasn't just a vague shape anymore. The figure became clearer, and as it did, Emma realized with horror that it was dressed in something resembling a tattered red coat. The fabric was ragged, fraying at the edges, yet the coat itself had an eerily familiar appearance. It looked like something Santa Claus would wear. But this was no jolly, cheerful figure bringing presents. The face of the figure was completely obscured, hidden in darkness, making it impossible to know what was beneath that shadow. "Mom, look, there's someone in the room," Emma cried out, her voice rising in panic. But when Alan and Lisa turned to look, the figure was gone. They scanned the room, but nothing was there. The only movement was the soft swaying of the tree's ornaments, caused by a light breeze from the open window. Emma's heart raced, her eyes wide with disbelief. She turned back to the spot where the figure had been standing, but there was no trace of it. "Emma, Ben, everything okay?" Alan asked, his voice filled with concern. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. How could she explain what she had seen? How could she make sense of it when there was nothing there now to prove it? "I'm fine," she finally said, though her voice trembled. "I thought I saw something, but I guess it was just my imagination." Ben nodded, but he seemed uneasy too, his wide eyes scanning the room. "Yeah, I thought I saw it too, Em." Lisa and Alan exchanged glances, but didn't push the matter further. The night continued as planned, with dinner served and presents opened, but the sense of unease lingered. Despite the holiday cheer that filled the house, there was a shadow that clung to the edges of the Johnson family's Christmas Eve, a shadow that neither of the children could shake off. Later that night, as the house settled into silence and everyone had retired to their rooms, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had truly imagined what she saw. The warmth of the fire had long since died down, and the house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood. She thought back to the figure by the tree, the way it had stood still, its shape so unnatural and its face hidden. What had it wanted? And why had it disappeared when her parents came into the room? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching them, waiting, and that it was still out there, lingering in the shadows. Just as she was starting to drift off to sleep, a sudden noise made her sit up straight in bed. A soft rustling, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from downstairs near the Christmas tree. The Johnson family settled into a comfortable rhythm as the night carried on. Laughter echoed through the living room as the children excitedly tore through their presents, while Alan and Lisa exchanged smiles over their shared satisfaction in seeing their kids so happy. The warmth of the Christmas lights and the crackling fire seemed to promise that everything would be perfect. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she kept glancing toward the tree where the shadow had stood just moments ago. Ben, busy playing with his new toys, didn't seem to notice Emma's unease. He was too caught up in the excitement of the holiday. But Emma couldn't focus on the presents or the joy that filled the room. She had to know what had happened. Taking a deep breath, she carefully stood up and quietly made her way to the tree. Her legs felt like lead, each step slow and deliberate as she moved closer. The shadows cast by the tree's lights flickered, making the room seem alive with movement. But the place where the figure had been was still empty. Just as Emma was about to reach the tree, a chilling sensation crept up her spine. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. Slowly, the figure reappeared, not from thin air, but as if it had been waiting for her to approach. It stood motionless again. Only this time, there was something more. The figure was closer, almost as if it had been drawn to her presence, as if it had been watching her every move. But what happened next was far more terrifying than anything Emma had expected. The figure, still shrouded in darkness, suddenly moved. Its head tilted slowly, and for the first time, it seemed to acknowledge her presence. The figure's face was hidden, but then, without warning, it smiled. The smile wasn't normal, nor was it anything that resembled the warmth and joy of the season. It was grotesque, wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. The teeth that filled the smile were sharp, too sharp, and its lips seemed to curl upward in an expression that felt far more sinister than anything Emma had ever seen. Frozen in place, Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to scream for her parents, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body was rooted to the spot by a sense of dread that gripped her chest. The smile seemed to mock her as the figure's form began to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing slowly and completely as if it had never been there at all. Emma stood in the empty room, her eyes searching the space where the figure had been. The family continued to laugh in the background, unaware of what had just happened in the shadows. The fire crackled, and the Christmas music played on, completely indifferent to the strange and terrifying encounter Emma had just experienced. She looked around, half expecting the figure to return, but nothing was there. Only the soft glow of the tree and the warmth of the fire remained. Emma swallowed hard, trying to convince herself that it had been a trick of the light, that her mind had simply played tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that something had been there, something that wasn't meant to be. As the night wore on, Emma kept glancing at the tree, half waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. The shadows seemed to have faded into the night, and the Johnson family's Christmas celebration continued, as if the terror Emma had felt was just a passing figment of her imagination. The next morning, Christmas Day, arrived with the promise of new beginnings and joy. The children excitedly rushed downstairs to see what Santa had left them. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and the warmth of the morning sun filled the house, bringing with it a sense of normalcy. But Emma, still feeling the weight of what she had witnessed, couldn't push the memory of the shadow from her mind. As she moved toward the Christmas tree to grab a gift, her foot caught something on the floor. She knelt down, thinking it was just another forgotten piece of wrapping paper or a stray ornament. But when she looked closer, her heart stopped. There, lying on the hardwood floor, was a lollipop. The bright red swirl of the candy seemed out of place, especially since neither Emma nor Ben had seen it before. But it wasn't the lollipop itself that terrified Emma. It was the symbol etched into the wrapper, a symbol she didn't recognize, one that made her skin crawl. The design looked like an unholy mark, an ancient symbol of something dark, something evil. She stared at it, unable to look away, her stomach twisted in horror, her mind racing to comprehend the implications of what she had found. The figure had left something behind, a trace, a sign. Emma quickly reached down and snatched the lollipop, her hands shaking. She turned it over, hoping it would reveal some logical explanation, but the symbol remained unchanged. Her pulse raced as she tucked it into her pocket, not sure if she should show anyone. It was just too much to explain. How could she tell her parents that a shadowy figure had left behind a cursed object in their living room? That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Emma remained silent, her thoughts swirling with the terrifying events of the night before. She glanced at the tree, half expecting the figure to reappear, but it didn't. Everything seemed normal. The house was filled with the comforting sounds of family and celebration. Yet, Emma could not forget the shadow beneath the tree. The smile, the lollipop, the unholy symbol. She knew deep down that something had come to visit them, and it wasn't finished. The unease in her gut never left her. Her family dismissed her worries, chalking up her strange behavior to the stress of the holidays or perhaps her overactive imagination. They didn't believe her, and they couldn't understand the weight of the terror she carried. But Emma could never forget what she had seen, and she would never forget the shadow under the tree. Story 2. The Stranger at the Door. The soft glow of the Christmas tree lights flickered gently across the living room, casting a warm, golden hue over the couple. Amelia and Mark had spent the evening alone together, enjoying their quiet holiday celebration. The hum of Christmas carols filled the air, and the scent of mulled wine and freshly baked cookies lingered in the room. It was the perfect evening, a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of the world outside. Amelia, curled up on the couch with a blanket, smiled at Mark as he set down his empty wine glass. They exchanged a quiet, contented glance. The world outside seemed so far away, just a distant memory, as they basked in the calm of the night. But then, a sudden knock echoed through the house. The sound was sharp, almost startling in the stillness of the evening. Mark turned toward the door, his brow furrowed. Amelia, equally confused, glanced at him with a hint of concern. Their house sat alone at the edge of the neighborhood, away from the streetlights, making the isolation all the more noticeable. Who could be out there at this hour? Mark stood and walked to the door, glancing at Amelia, who watched him with uncertainty. As he opened the door, the cold air rushed in, and he stepped outside, scanning the front porch. But there was no one. He stared into the dark, empty yard where the snow was falling steadily, a quiet blanket of white covering everything in sight. A chill ran down his spine. Had he imagined it? Who was it? Amelia asked, her voice trembling slightly as she moved toward him. Mark shook his head, closing the door behind him. There's no one out there. Maybe just the wind or someone passing by. But before he could settle back into his chair, another knock echoed louder than before. This time it wasn't the wind. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. The knock was insistent, unnerving. She looked at Mark, who appeared just as unsettled. Should we answer it again? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, his curiosity getting the better of him. This time, when he opened the door, a man stood in the snow, soaked to the bone. His clothes were wet and clung to his thin frame, his face pale as though he had been wandering for hours. His breath came in quick, ragged bursts, and his eyes darted from side to side as though searching for something, someone. I'm so sorry to trouble you, the man said, his voice shaky and strained. I lost my way, and I don't know where I am. Amelia's first instinct was to ask if he was okay, but something about the man's appearance felt off. His eyes were wide and restless, his gaze avoiding theirs, like he couldn't quite make eye contact. The snow on his coat seemed out of place, too. The way it clung to his clothes suggested he had been out for far longer than he let on. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine, but softened when he noticed the man's desperate state. Come in. You look freezing, he said, his voice kind despite the odd feeling gnawing at him. The man nodded, stepping into the warm house, his boots leaving wet marks on the floor. Amelia moved quickly to help him out of his wet coat, feeling the dampness seep into her fingers. She offered him a towel, and the man accepted it silently, still not looking them in the eye. As he sat down in the living room, Mark and Amelia exchanged a glance. Their comfortable evening had suddenly turned tense. The man, though clearly in need of help, seemed to carry an unsettling air. It wasn't just the chill he brought in with him. There was something else, something that made the room feel colder despite the warmth of the fire crackling nearby. Do you need anything else? Amelia asked cautiously, trying to keep the conversation light. We can give you a ride to somewhere if you're lost. But the man only shook his head, his eyes darting around the room as though scanning every inch of it. "I don't need a ride. I need to find something," he muttered under his breath. Amelia frowned, her unease deepening. "Find something? What do you mean?" The man's response was a vague, disjointed murmur. "Something in this house, something that's here." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, making Amelia's chest tighten. Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't make sense of what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a little sharper now, more cautious than before. The man looked up at her, his expression strange, almost wild. His face seemed gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were dark, too dark, with a hollow emptiness that made Amelia feel as though he were looking through her, not at her. "I need to find it," he repeated, his voice barely audible. A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. There was something wrong with this man. The words he spoke didn't make sense, and his behavior, his erratic movements and the way he kept glancing around was unsettling. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice tight now. "You should rest. Maybe you need to lie down. We can help you." But the man ignored him. Instead, he stood abruptly and began pacing, muttering to himself. "I'm close. It's close. I just need to find it." His movements were frantic, his breathing shallow. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. Her instincts screamed at her to call the police, but she didn't want to escalate things further. "We can help you," she said gently, but the man didn't seem to hear her. Suddenly, he stopped pacing. His eyes locked onto the Christmas tree, and he seemed to freeze. There was a long, drawn-out silence in the room, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. "I found it," the man whispered, a chilling smile creeping across his face. The smile was twisted, unnerving, almost too wide, too much like a grin that didn't belong. As he stepped closer to the tree, Amelia and Mark exchanged worried glances. Something about this man was wrong. They had invited him in out of kindness, but now, every instinct told them they had made a mistake. The man's hand reached out, trembling slightly, toward the pile of gifts beneath the tree. Amelia's pulse raced, and she opened her mouth to speak, to ask him what he was doing. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned toward them, his smile faltering. His eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with something darker, something that sent a surge of terror through Amelia's veins. "Get out," the man said, his voice no longer pleading. It was cold, commanding. "You shouldn't have let me in." Mark and Amelia froze, their minds racing for an explanation. But before either of them could react, the man turned and bolted out the door into the night. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving an eerie silence in the room. Neither Mark nor Amelia could move at first, too stunned to process what had just happened. The quiet of the house felt oppressive now. It wasn't the same. Something had changed. Something that had been lurking outside had come inside. And now, the house felt colder than it ever had before. The once comforting crackling of the fire now seemed distant, almost foreign. Amelia glanced at Mark, her voice trembling. Do you think he was really lost?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the door, his hand still gripping the handle. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled, and a shiver passed through him. The unsettling events of that night did not stop when the man left. The house had returned to its eerie silence, but Amelia and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The warmth of the fire seemed colder now, the glow from the Christmas lights flickering with an unnatural intensity. Amelia, still sitting on the couch, stared at the door where the stranger had left. Mark stood near the window, peering out into the snow, but there was no sign of the man, no trace of his presence in the quiet night. It was almost as if he had never been there. The couple exchanged uneasy glances. Their minds raced to make sense of what had happened. The man's odd behavior, his unexplained familiarity with their house, and his strange, cryptic words. None of it made sense. And yet, it was clear that something was very wrong. Mark rubbed his forehead, his frustration growing. That guy, he wasn't just lost. He knew things he shouldn't have known. Amelia shuddered, her eyes darting to the Christmas tree, the soft sound of the fire crackling in the background. What do you think he meant when he said, I found it. And why did he act like he knew this place? Mark didn't respond immediately. He walked toward the mantel and picked up a framed photograph, one taken just after they had moved into the house. They had always loved the peaceful, secluded area, the perfect spot for a quiet life away from the noise of the city. But as he stared at the picture, something about the old photograph sent a chill through him. The house in the photo seemed different, older, though it was only taken a few years ago. Before Amelia could ask what he was looking at, Mark shook his head and placed the photo back on the mantel. I don't know. I think we need to find out more about this place. This house. Something's not right. Amelia stood and walked toward the living room window, her gaze drifting out into the snow-covered yard. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe he was just a guy who... No, Mark interrupted, his voice firm. I don't believe in coincidences. And there's more to this than just some lost traveler. A sudden chill ran through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the sensation of cold dread that had settled deep in her bones. Mark moved quickly, heading to the kitchen, where the old bookshelf stood against the far wall. The previous owners of the house had left behind an assortment of books, many of them outdated and dusty, but Mark had always found comfort in the idea of keeping some of the house's history. As he scanned the titles, a small, weathered journal caught his eye, its spine cracked and frayed. It had been tucked away in the corner of the shelf, almost as if it were hidden. He opened the journal, flipping through the pages until a few words at the top of the first page caught his attention. The Christmas tragedy. Amelia heard Mark's voice quiver as he spoke. This journal, it's written by one of the previous owners. It talks about something that happened here. Something terrible. Amelia's stomach twisted, and she crossed the room, drawn to the journal. She looked over Mark's shoulder, reading the words over his arm. The journal detailed a gruesome event that had taken place years ago, on a Christmas Eve much like the one they were celebrating now. It was a crime, one that had been covered up by the authorities. The journal recounted an eerie series of events involving a family, a stranger, and an unspeakable act that had left the house haunted by the consequences. The most chilling part of the journal was the description of the man, the very same figure who had appeared at their door. It described a stranger who had arrived in the snow, just as the man had, a man who seemed to know the house and its occupants. He had been invited inside, just like the man who had knocked on their door. But according to the journal, this stranger was no ordinary man. He was described as a vengeful spirit, trapped in the house by the bloodshed that had occurred years before. The journal's author spoke of strange occurrences, of things moving on their own, of cold spots, and of whispers in the dark. And as Mark continued reading, his blood ran cold. The last entry in the journal read, "He's here again. It's Christmas Eve, and I hear the knocking at the door. I fear that the stranger will return, and this time, he will finish what was started." Amelia recoiled from the book as if it had burned her. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the man, the one who came to our door." Mark nodded, his hand trembling as he closed the journal. His mind raced. How had the stranger known about the house, about the Christmas tragedy that had taken place all those years ago? It was as if he had come back to claim something unfinished. "What are we going to do?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark didn't answer right away. The truth was he wasn't sure. How could he explain to Amelia that they were no longer alone in their home, that the house held a dark secret, one that had never truly been buried? He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on them, the walls growing closer, as if the house itself was closing in on them. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice thick with dread, "but I think we need to leave tonight." Before he could even finish his sentence, the room went dark. The Christmas lights flickered and died, and the fire in the hearth sputtered out, leaving them in complete darkness. The cold air pressed in, filling the room with an unnatural chill. Amelia grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "Mark, what's happening? What's going on?" "I don't know," Mark answered, his voice strained. "But I think the stranger is still here, and he's not leaving. We have to get out of here now." The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, soft, deliberate, and coming closer. Mark and Amelia froze, their breath catching in their throats. The stranger was back. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. The man from before, drenched in snow, his face twisted in an eerie smile, stepped back into the house. "I found it," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. "It's time to finish what I started." Mark and Amelia exchanged a terrified glance. They had made a mistake letting him in. Now it was too late. The figure slowly advanced toward them, his presence overwhelming, like a shadow that consumed the light. The house seemed to breathe, its walls closing in tighter with every step. And as the man neared, the temperature plummeted, the air thick with an oppressive weight. "We never should have opened that door," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The stranger smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that stretched unnaturally across his face. "You should have listened," he said, stepping closer. "Now, you'll never leave." Story 3. The Christmas Caller. The house was calm still, almost too still for Christmas Eve. Amelia sank into the soft armchair in her cozy living room, cradling a steaming mug of hot cocoa between her hands. The warmth from the drink was comforting, but the emptiness of the house felt like a void that no warmth could fill. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its soft lights flickering gently, casting a peaceful glow throughout the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall quietly, blanketing the world in a thick layer of white, muffling the noises of the world beyond. The night had been quiet, almost too quiet. Amelia had spent the evening alone, no family or friends to share the holiday with. Her best friend, Lily, had been gone for years, disappeared under mysterious circumstances that no one could explain. The authorities had given up searching long ago, and Amelia had tried, with varying degrees of success, to move on. But tonight, as the evening wore on, something in the air seemed different. She couldn't quite place it. Just a lingering feeling that the quiet around her was not the peaceful kind she had hoped for. As the clock struck midnight, breaking the silence of the night, the phone rang. The shrill tone cut through the stillness like a sharp blade, causing Amelia's heart to skip a beat. She set down her mug on the coffee table, hesitated for a moment, then reached for the receiver. She didn't recognize the number on the display, but that wasn't unusual. Telemarketers and unknown callers had become a regular part of life. She lifted the phone to her ear, her voice quiet as she answered, "Hello." For a moment, there was nothing but static, crackling sounds like the phone line had somehow been interfered with. But then, through the distortion, she heard a familiar voice. It took her a moment to register what she was hearing, her mind struggling to make sense of it. The voice sounded so clear, yet so distant, like it was coming from another world. "Amelia," the voice whispered. It was unmistakable. It was Lily. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She sat up straighter in the chair, her pulse quickening. "Lily, is that really you?" The voice on the other end of the line was soft, but unmistakable, carrying an eerie quality to it that made Amelia shiver. "It's me, Amelia. I've been watching you." She felt a lump form in her throat. The line was heavy with tension, and she struggled to find her voice. But you're gone. You disappeared years ago. We never found out what happened to you. We looked everywhere. Amelia's voice trailed off, the grief she had tried so hard to bury bubbling up to the surface again. The voice on the other end was still calm, almost soothing, but there was an underlying distortion that sent a chill down her spine. "You won't find out what really happened. No one will. But I'm still here, Amelia, watching over you, watching everything." A cold shiver ran through Amelia, and her hand tightened around the receiver. How was this possible? How could Lily be talking to her from the other side of wherever she was? It didn't make sense. She hadn't been able to accept that her friend was gone all those years ago. And now, with this strange phone call, the impossible was becoming real in the most unsettling way. How are you doing this? Where are you?" Amelia stammered, her mind racing. The voice, still so familiar, so comforting, yet so unnerving, responded in a soft whisper. "I'm not gone, Amelia. I'm always with you. You just didn't know it before." Amelia's breath came in shallow gasps, her thoughts a whirlwind. The feeling in the room, which had been oddly peaceful only moments ago, shifted to something darker, heavier. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see Lily standing in the doorway, a ghostly figure just beyond the reach of the flickering Christmas lights. The voice continued, slow and deliberate. "You never truly leave Christmas, Amelia. Not when the ties are this strong. I've been here all along, and now you'll never be able to escape me." The words were like a cold slap to the face. Amelia's pulse raced, her chest tight with fear. She tried to shake the feeling off, to remind herself it was just a prank. Maybe some sick joke from someone who knew too much. But the voice, it was Lily's voice. How could it be a joke? The phone crackled again, and there was a pause, the line growing quiet for a moment too long. Amelia's mind was racing, desperate for answers. But the longer the silence stretched, the heavier her anxiety became. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice whispered one final, bone-chilling message. "Merry Christmas, Amelia." The phone went dead. Silence filled the room. Amelia sat frozen in place, the receiver still pressed to her ear. But there was no sound anymore, just the silence that stretched out before her like an abyss. Her hand trembled as she slowly set the phone back down on the table, her heart pounding in her chest. It was impossible. It couldn't have been Lily. But the voice, the things it said, everything about the call was unmistakable. How had this happened? And why had she said she was watching over her? What did it all mean? The sound of the Christmas lights flickering in the background seemed louder now, like the whole house had grown colder, darker. Amelia stood up from the chair, her legs shaky as she moved toward the window, needing to do something. Anything to take her mind off the call. But when she looked outside, the snow had stopped. The world was still. Not a single sound broke the quiet, not even the wind. She turned back toward the living room and noticed something strange. The Christmas tree, which had been carefully decorated earlier that evening, now seemed to be different. The lights were no longer twinkling. Instead, they blinked erratically, as if something was controlling them. Suddenly, there was a soft thump from behind her, a noise so quiet it could have been easily dismissed, but it was enough to send her heart racing. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was in the room with her. The phone call had shaken her to the core, and now, everything around her felt wrong. Something was in the air, something she couldn't explain, but it was heavy, oppressive. She glanced back at the window, but there was nothing outside, nothing to explain the feeling of being watched. And then, as if the air itself was holding its breath, the phone rang again. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that the phone call was more than just some bizarre trick. The voice, her best friend's voice, sounded so real, so familiar. Yet, the way it echoed through the phone line, warped and distant, filled her with an unsettling dread. She had spent years mourning Lily's disappearance, but now, with that haunting phone call, the past had come rushing back in full force. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, like something deep within the universe was forcing her to confront the truth she had buried for so long. Unable to ignore the nagging sense of dread, Amelia knew she had to uncover what really happened to Lily. She had to understand if the call was just a cruel prank or if there was something far more sinister at play. But the more she thought about it, the more one question consumed her. Why Christmas? Determined to find answers, Amelia dove into the dark corners of Lily's life, retracing her steps in an effort to uncover anything that might explain the strange phone call. She started by revisiting Lily's journals, which she had kept hidden away for years. The journals contained fragments of thoughts, poems, and odd entries that painted a portrait of a young woman who had been searching for something powerful and dangerous. As Amelia flipped through the pages, she came across a cryptic passage that caught her attention. It was a single line written in Lily's neat handwriting. "They'll come for me on Christmas Eve, and I'll never be the same." Amelia paused, her breath catching in her throat. That was the first real clue she had, and it sent a chill down her spine. Desperate to learn more, she turned to the only person who might have known what Lily had been involved in during the months leading up to her disappearance, Dr. Samuel Harris, a former professor at the university where they all studied. Dr. Harris had been Lily's mentor, someone who had known her better than anyone else, but he had also disappeared after her death, leaving behind only a handful of cryptic notes. Amelia tracked him down to a small, secluded house on the outskirts of town. He was hesitant to speak at first, his eyes darting nervously as if he feared someone or something might be watching. But when Amelia mentioned Lily's name, his expression hardened, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "I told her to stay away," Dr. Harris muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen." "What was she involved in, Dr. Harris? What was so dangerous about her?" Amelia pressed, her voice urgent. The professor looked around the room, as though checking for any hidden listeners, before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily became involved in something much darker than she realized. There's a secretive group that practices ancient rituals. They promised her power, immortality even. They told her they could bring her closer to something otherworldly. But that's not what she was getting into. It's a cult, Amelia. A cult that uses Christmas Eve for their rituals. Amelia's mind raced as she processed Dr. Harris's words. A cult. Christmas Eve rituals. It all seemed so far-fetched, but the more she thought about it, the more it fit the strange occurrences she had been experiencing. Could the cult have something to do with the phone call? Could Lily have been part of something that bridged the gap between the living and the dead? Dr. Harris continued, his voice strained. The cult believes that Christmas Eve is a time when the boundary between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. They perform a ritual, a dark one, to call forth spirits and to claim the power of those who have passed. But they don't just summon the dead, they trap them. They manipulate them, twist their souls into something other than human. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. Do you think Lily became one of them? Is that why she disappeared? Dr. Harris nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. Yes, I believe she did. After that Christmas Eve, she was never the same. She was different, almost as if her soul was no longer her own. I tried to help her, but it was too late. Whatever she became that night, it wasn't her anymore. Amelia felt sick to her stomach. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that Lily hadn't just vanished. She had become something else, something darker. But what did that mean for Amelia? Was the phone call a sign that Lily, or whatever she had become, was still reaching out from beyond the grave? As Amelia pieced together the fragments of her investigation, one thought consumed her. The voice on the phone, the things it said, it wasn't just Lily. It couldn't have been. What had happened to her had transformed her into something unrecognizable, something that existed in the liminal space between life and death. The real question now was, what did it want with Amelia? Days passed as Amelia continued to dig deeper, trying to understand the true nature of the cult and the ritual that had taken place on that fateful Christmas Eve. The more she learned, the more she felt herself unraveling. She had always prided herself on being a rational person, but now she wasn't sure if she was still part of the living world. Could the strange things happening to her be a result of the same ritual that had claimed Lily? Was she slowly being pulled into the same darkness? Her nights became restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel the cold presence of Lily, or whatever had become of her, hovering just behind her. The phone calls came more frequently now, each one more unsettling than the last. The voice no longer sounded like Lily. It sounded like something older, something malevolent. And then, one night, as the Christmas lights flickered softly in the background, Amelia found herself staring into the mirror. The reflection that stared back at her was no longer her own. Her eyes were hollow, distant, and as she blinked, she thought she saw a shadow pass behind her, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A cold, dark figure, watching her every move. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. A thought dawned on her, a terrible realization. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and she was no longer sure which side she stood on. Had she crossed over? Had the cult claimed her as well? Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to make sense of the impossible. One thing was certain, the voice on the phone hadn't been Lily. It had been something much older, much darker, and it was watching her now, waiting. As she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, she felt the presence grow closer. And this time, it wasn't just a voice on the other end of the phone. This time, it was standing right behind her, and it whispered, "Merry Christmas, Amelia." The lights flickered once more, and the world went dark. As the chill of winter settles in, and the warmth of Christmas lights flicker across homes, there is an undeniable sense of dread that lingers beneath the surface. For many, the holiday season is a time of togetherness, of family, joy, and festive cheer. But what if, beneath the sparkling decorations and the sweet smells of gingerbread, there lies a darker truth? These Christmas stories serve as a stark reminder that the world around us is not always as it seems. They strip away the comforting illusion of the holidays, revealing something far more unsettling and mysterious. The holidays, often regarded as a time to embrace warmth and love, can also be a time when the veil between the living and the unknown becomes thin. The stories we've shared highlight this contrast. The world of comfort and happiness juxtaposed with the creeping fear that something sinister may be lurking just beyond the reach of our understanding. Each tale, whether it's of a mysterious visitor at the door, a disembodied phone call, or the revelation of hidden truths, speaks to the fragility of our world. They challenge the idea that the holiday season, so firmly anchored in tradition and festivity, is immune to the darker forces that lie just out of sight. The message within these stories is clear. The world we live in, for all its beauty and joy, is fragile. We may feel safe in the routines of our daily lives, especially during moments of comfort like Christmas, but those moments can easily be shattered by forces beyond our comprehension. Whether they come in the form of an unexplained visitor, an eerie phone call, or a disturbing revelation, the unknown has a way of creeping into our lives when we least expect it. These tales remind us that the boundaries we place around our world, what we deem possible and impossible, alive and dead, are often arbitrary. Our assumptions about safety, about what is real, can be shattered in an instant. The holiday season, which we so often associate with peace and goodwill, is no exception. In fact, it could be the very time when unsettling encounters force us to confront our deepest fears, challenging our beliefs about life, death, and what lies beyond. But perhaps, as the stories suggest, it's not just the unknown that's at play here. Perhaps these unsettling experiences are not merely the result of a vivid imagination or the creeping tendrils of fear. Maybe they are a reminder of something more profound, that our perceptions of reality are limited and that there is much we cannot see or understand. In a world where we often seek answers, these stories leave us with more questions than solutions. Is it our imagination running wild, or is there something darker at work, silently influencing the events that unfold around us? As the final moments of each story play out, whether it's the chilling presence at the door, the disturbing phone call, or the haunting realization of a past never fully understood, the question remains. Is it all just a trick of the mind, a terrifying tale spun from the darkest corners of our subconscious? Or is there something more sinister at work, something we can neither explain nor control? The true lesson these stories offer may not be something that can be neatly packaged or easily understood. Instead, it may lie in the unsettling realization that our world is far more mysterious than we'd like to believe. The comforting glow of Christmas lights, the sounds of carols in the air, and the joy of family gatherings all come with the knowledge that there is always a shadow just around the corner, waiting to remind us of the limits of our understanding. And so, we are left with a choice: to ignore the creeping dread, to close our eyes to the shadows that lurk just out of sight, or to acknowledge the fragility of the world around us and the mysteries it holds. Maybe the greatest lesson of all is that, in a world where reality often feels uncertain, it's better to approach every moment with caution and curiosity, wondering perhaps if we are truly alone in this season of light, or if something else, something much darker, is quietly watching over us all. In the end, the stories have no clear answer. Whether they are born of imagination or some deeper, darker truth, their ambiguity leaves us questioning everything we thought we knew. As we hang our stockings and light our trees, we must ask ourselves, what is really out there, and how much of it do we truly understand? Perhaps the answers, like the holidays themselves, are more complex than we'll ever fully grasp.